All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name's Jen. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn Anomalous Characters, the Children of the Loyalists. Our presenter today, Shea Hendry, is a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium grantee. She's a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, and her research is focused on the children of Loyalist exiles in the Age of Revolution, though she is broadly interested in refugee communities, national identity, and transnational exchange. Shea previously completed her MS in library science with a concentration in archive management and her MA in history at Simmons University in Boston. So we're really excited to have you here today, Shea, and see what you've found so far in your research. Welcome.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. And I will go ahead and share my screen so you all have hopefully something a little bit more interesting to look at than me just sitting here and talking. So let me do this. Perfect. Okay. So thank you so much, Jen, for that introduction. As she mentioned, my research is broadly focused on the children of Loyalist refugees, not necessarily as children within the sort of revolutionary moment, but as adults that are coming into maturity throughout the early national period and who have this really interesting capacity to inhabit sort of intermedial spaces between the US and Britain. So my talk today is entitled Anomalous Characters, the Children of the Loyalist, and I'm conscious of the fact that that is a little bit broad, and we're definitely going to get into some quite specific case studies. But I want to just kind of draw attention to the phrase anomalous characters. We'll talk quite a bit throughout this presentation about national character as a phrase that comes into use quite frequently, particularly among the type of people that I study. But this kind of deployment of the phrase anomalous character then in conjunction with the idea of national character becomes very, very interesting. So let me, ooh. There it goes. Okay. So Sarah Troutbeck sailed across the Atlantic 3 times before she settled in a small Cheshire cottage, a long way, so far as she saw it from just about everything. Sarah lived with her widowed mother and younger sister, all of them formerly of Boston, all of them displaced during the American Revolution. Sarah's father was an Anglican minister who sided with the British, moved the family to England, and then promptly died, leaving his wife and daughters in quite a precarious situation. And so for a number of years, they lived a sort of quiet life, an ocean away from old friends. But Sarah will remark a number of times in her correspondence how close she felt to fellow Americans, how often she found herself running into other Americans. On one occasion in March 1792, she writes, quote, "I have often wondered what would have been the plea with beggars if it had not been for the American War. We are known to be Americans, and this country," referring to England, "abounds with beggars, but half of them call themselves Americans or have left a leg, an arm, or a husband in that country. Only a few," Sarah insisted, "were actually what they said they were." And she doesn't reveal in her sort of casual musing what gauge she's drawing upon to separate fact from fiction, but I found this to be quite a salient quote to get at this idea about the performance of Americanism as something that is incredibly contentious in the decades after independence, and nowhere is it kind of more debated than among the itinerant communities who are going to continue to traverse the Atlantic. In current scholarship, you'll often see these people referred to as border crossers, but among them, we're talking about dispirited refugees, which is, of course, kind of the subsection that I'm particularly interested in, but also merchants, sailors, politicians, artists, soldiers, and all sorts of ordinary people with their own kind of inclinations and agendas. So Sarah Troutbeck's sort of disingenuous beggars, as she personified them, really represent an ideological dilemma, which is actively confounding politicians on either side of this new geopolitical divide. That being that the parameters of national belonging were unstable and ill-defined, and citizens, even kind of a decade or so after independence and more, still looked and sounded a lot like subjects, so the implications of holding either status were rapidly changing. So a credible performance of American identity might be financially advantageous or engender personal liberties, but the opposite was equally true, and there was this sort of uncomfortable ambiguity lingering between the two nations, which no one quite knows how to rectify yet. People possessed a kind of remarkable capacity to defy political labels, including ones that they'd chosen for themselves. And so we see men and women throughout this period wearing many identities at once. Sarah has this other great quote where she says, quote, "I reverence a king, and while life remains, I would defend him, but so few men are fit for kings, and I am half a Republican." So within these scattered communities of political exiles, there are many, often the sons and daughters of more resolute loyalists, removed from American colonies in their adolescence or infancy, who profess this sort of prolonged duality of allegiance. Some claim to embody both Americanness and Britishness, while others move through the world with a kind of casual disregard for the political boundaries the revolution imposed. As late as 1834, John Quincy Adams would describe one such man as about one half Englishman and the other half American. By Adams' estimation, this man claimed to belong to both countries and might have a reasonable claim to the rights of citizenship or of subjection transferable with his person at his own option. And what I think is really essential to remember here is that we're talking about this Anglo-American relationship throughout a period where we're at the height of the impressment crisis, where the US and Britain are essentially going to go to war in 1812. And one of the sort of major causes of the war, as far as kind of the political rhetoric of the time is concerned, is impressment and is Britain's kind of perpetual violation of the rights of this sort of American identity and their refusal to give it the gravity and the respect that it deserves in sort of international waters. So we have a sort of top-down understanding of this period where nationality as something has become so ingrained that we can fight wars to protect it. And then if we look at these sort of fringe cases, what's going to become much clearer is that there's simultaneous to this a kind of incredible insecurity about the American national character. So we see these people kind of asking through their actions and even kind of directly through their words in all sorts of ways, what nationality even is, what are the moments when people are suddenly forced to see themselves as nationals, and how do we reconcile ourselves to those processes, and why is nationality important? When must it become important? And is there any way to kind of move back from that once that process has begun? Let's see. So for much of the 18th century, just to give you, I think, some important grounding, imperial officials regulated subjecthood abroad through informal observation. The Atlantic world embraced a common logic dependent on the immutability of allegiance between subject and sovereign, which presupposed cultural distinctions were determinative of political status. So this is kind of a massive oversimplification, but the kind of working presumption was that Frenchmen, for example, presumably spoke French, and therefore French-speaking men in foreign ports, in all probability, still owed their allegiance to the King of France. And that was the kind of functional shorthand, which is not to say that it was actively functional in all contexts. And the reality is, of course, much messier. But what happens post-independence is the United States introduces this kind of national affinity, which is going to very quickly begin to aggravate the informality of that previous system. When the United States violently rejected these kind of innate and voluntary allegiances, and refashioned the relationship between the citizen and the state on the basis of consent. It introduced a national affiliation, which was elective to a certain extent and culturally indeterminate. Both countries, speaking to the United States and Britain, quickly implemented new legal regimes to entrench this sort of political divide. But independence did not kind of instantaneously produce a discernible American citizenry with its own self-evident identifiers that would have made it possible for this kind of past system of informal observation to continue to function as is. So, for example, the kind of catch-22 that many men found themselves in quite quickly is if we're talking about two English-speaking sailors, both of them strangers in a foreign city or in a foreign port, and they're kind of seeking financial assistance or legal redress or anything that would have these kind of significant implications, what sort of behaviors are now accessible to us to differentiate where they might have come from, what sort of nation they belong to. So to give you a really interesting case study that I think unpacks a lot of these ideas, in November 1797, British naval authorities seized the Indian Chief, which was a merchant vessel, as it docked at the Port of Cowes on the Isle of Wight, so just off the southern coast of England. The ship and its crew were nearing the end of a 2-year journey, having sailed from London to India, with additional stopovers in Portuguese Madeira and Dutch Batavia before returning to England. British officials accused ship owner Joshua Johnson, who you see pictured on your screen here, who was at the time the American consul in London and then father-in-law eventually to John Quincy Adams. British officials accused him of trading with His Majesty's enemies. The kind of long and short of that is that maritime law at the time imposed restrictive legal parameters over transatlantic commerce, which were essentially designed to regulate the flow of goods between colonial markets and their metropole. The British High Court of Admiralty then tried Johnson's case in early 1801, where the primary point of concern is Johnson's alleged identity. His accusers argue that the American consul's 26-year residence in London made him a British merchant and liable thereunder to the laws governing subjects of the British Empire. Johnson had moved to England from the American colonies in 1771, so prior to the Revolution, and he'd remained abroad until September 1797, which is when he set out to return to the United States. Sir William Scott was the judge who tried the case, and he ultimately ruled in Johnson's favor. As he said, there are two positions which are not to be controverted. First, that Mr. Johnson is generally an American by birth, and second, that he has not lost the benefit of his native American character. The particularities of the case were much more complex. So from 1783 to 1797, Johnson was, in his words, undoubtedly to be considered an English trader. His employment as the American consul was perfectly immaterial to the legal effect of determining his national character. So for decades, he's functionally an English merchant. Judge Scott then ruled that Johnson legally became an American from the moment he set foot on board the vessel to return to the United States, which conveniently for Johnson happened just 1 month before the British confiscated his ship. The judge's ruling was not an attempt to argue that all men living abroad for prolonged periods severed all legal ties to their native countries until they set out to return, but an acknowledgement that individual particularities complicated the 1783 dissolution of governance in the arbitration of citizenship or subjecthood. Essentially, exceptional cases prolonged the terms of this separation. And really, for kind of today's purposes, what's important to understand from this case is that there's this sort of contemporary separation between the embodiment of an American national character from the legal allocation of American citizenship, meaning men with even more tenuous claims to citizenship could still rightfully embody this national character. And so in this conversation and throughout this period, we're not seeing people necessarily argue about the right to vote or the kind of things that are going to hold a lot more weight domestically when we're talking about citizenship. But we're seeing people argue over who gets to be representative of what an American is and thinks and does, and by virtue of that representation, what sort of foreign relationships will the US be able to claim, or what harm can people potentially do? So we're going to start talking specifically, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about this gentleman named George William Irving. In June 1801, George Irving became the US consul and American agent for seamen in London. So he essentially replaced Johnson's earlier replacement. And consuls, just to give you kind of a quick rundown, were public officials stationed in foreign ports to protect the economic interests of the sort of powers they represented. So in doing so, they could facilitate trade, offer protections to sailors, and in the cases of the early American consular service in particular, fulfill diplomatic responsibilities in instances where the US didn't have reciprocal representation, which throughout the early national period is especially common. And I think it's also important to note that there's really no expectation during this period that your US consul would be a US citizen. Irving himself was the son of a loyalist. He was 5 years old when he and his father left Boston and the family resettled in England. Irving very rarely talked about his own childhood publicly or the sort of family history that he had. He's kind of only attempts were to sort of obscure the Britishness of his own upbringing. So he talks quite a bit about his father's remorse, about how his father might have been this sort of dedicated monarchist, but he'd made his son an American through these sort of impassioned allegiances that he maintained to their native country. So we don't get many of the particulars, but that's kind of the setup that Irving publicly gave in terms of addressing his connections to loyalism. To give you some initial grounding before we get more into kind of Irving's career as consul in London, after the American Revolution, the US courts upheld the English common law right of soil, now, widely known as birthright citizenship, as determinative of membership within the country. So essentially, when we're thinking about the Loyalists, the presumption from the US courts is that men born in the parts of British North America, which became the United States, were citizens of the Republic until they elected to remove themselves. This is, of course, the American argument, which is quite different from the British argument. But then it creates quite quickly questions over the enduring status of individuals who did not necessarily choose to remove themselves, but were removed not by their own volition. So there's about a roughly 30-year period, the primary period in which these children are becoming adults, where there's no top-down legal determination as to their political status and what right they have to citizenship or subjecthood, or basically who's determined where they belong. The legal precedents which did exist theoretically enabled them to rightfully claim subjecthood in Britain and citizenship in the United States, kind of at their own option, or kind of more accurately for the period based on the merits of their sort of performance of either, if we're really thinking about how some of these things were worked out on the ground. So this ambiguity then enabled certain well-placed individuals throughout the period to self-define allegiance and nationality in a way that in retrospect helps us to better understand the parameters of this Anglo-American relationship. So I have this quote on the screen from one man named George Joy, who we won't talk about much today, but he has a very similar career as George Irving. And he writes it to James Madison in 1808, quote, "It cannot have escaped you that there is in this generation an anomalous character created by the events of our own time, namely the person born in America before independence and not having by any act of his own disenfranchised himself of the rights of a British subject. These rights were inheritable, as well as those of an American citizen, and it was better to allow in such the privilege of both than to agitate the question, which he insisted would presumably die away with the present possessors." And I think it's important to recognize that this is not a world in which dual citizenship is in any way permissible yet. That's still a long, long ways away. So this is actually quite a radical statement in many respects. And I want to acknowledge the kind of process of naturalized citizenship relative to this that is somewhat different, but also quite useful in elucidating our understanding of how this is going to work for these sort of children, now adults. The naturalization process is different. It's presuming that there is a sort of switch from subjecthood to citizenship, and we can see this kind of loyalty oaths that follow. And I included this in kind of a picture of one of these loyalty oaths, not because these are individuals who fall necessarily within the boundaries of what I study, but because these help us to work out the kind of legal thinking US courts and government administrative officers are doing regarding the age of maturity specific to nationality. So a lot of these documents will acknowledge that the person signing the loyalty oath is above the age of 21 or something to that regard. Sometimes different states have different age ranges for that. But when we're talking about these loyalist children, we have children who are going to exercise this right of election, as it's called in the revolutionary moment, or right of disaffirmation, as it's called in different court cases, where basically they're going to kind of avow themselves as citizens or subjecthoods much, much later than we see any of the kind of thinking around this moment of maturity as being 21 years old or something in that regard. So to get back to Irving, opportunity to exercise this kind of ambiguity or ambivalence didn't guarantee that it would work for anyone. Nor was it sort of, once you did it, you were good to go. It was kind of a perpetual process for most people. Irving initially began to return to the United States in the 1790s, kind of intermittently, as the representative of an English trading house. And he ultimately met Thomas Jefferson, who was vice president at the time, in February 1800. Samuel Adams is the one who makes the introduction, and when he does, he describes Irving as an English native, but assures Jefferson, don't worry, you'll be pleased with him. And Irving himself, I think, prior to this introduction, had tried to sort of acquire evidence that he was American, that he was a citizen. He visits James Monroe in Paris when Monroe is serving as the American minister to France in the mid-1790s, and asks Monroe at that point for a kind of certificate or something of that sort that will serve as a protection for him as an American citizen. And at that time, Monroe refuses to grant it. So the consulship, when Irving is awarded the consulship by Jefferson, in large part because the assistance Irving provided in Jefferson's presidential election campaign, this is his first official foreign appointment, and most importantly, a foreign appointment that did not require him to be a citizen. He would go on to have a pretty remarkably successful career in the diplomatic service. And so in many ways, it's a sort of transition point for him. But he, in taking the London consulship, will also become the US agent for sailors in London, which in the early 19th century is going to be quite a challenging job. So we'll get back to talking a little bit more about impressment. News on the impressment of American sailors and the very distressed state of mariners was really at the forefront of Irving's early reports. So he's kind of, as soon as he takes this consular appointment, he's really at the epicenter of some of these debates. In 1793, to give you kind of the broader context, the French Republic declared war on Great Britain. And this happens only weeks after the public execution of Louis XVI. And that war, kind of a succession of wars, but warfare in general, outlasted the sort of revolutionary fervor to then witness the rise of Napoleon and eventually ensnared most of Europe. It lasted for more than 2 decades. There was a brief armistice in the early 19th century, but really didn't end until 1815. And so Britain, while they're fighting these wars with France, their military strategy throughout the period is to weaponize their naval superiority. To target French forces and really to target transatlantic commerce. So Britain is going to undergo throughout the 1790s and early 19th century a sort of rapid expansion of maritime manpower. The US officially is going to remain neutral. Their sort of official policy is non-intervention. There's of course a lot of partisan infighting that's going to pretty violently divide public opinion in the United States over their responsibility towards Republican France, which of course had been a kind of revolutionary ally. But the US, in choosing to remain neutral, becomes the largest, throughout the course of the war, becomes the largest neutral carrier, meaning it is incredibly economically advantageous for them. Their merchant marine expands dramatically. US tonnage and foreign trade nearly tripled during this period. So what we have when Irving arrives in London is this massive simultaneous expansion of US shipping and this mass mobilization of the Royal Navy, which will very quickly spell disaster for a lot of American sailors. The Royal Navy is increasing its enrollment by tens of thousands. And if we're operating under this earlier system where we can assume Britishness was self-evident and English-speaking men are liable for these sort of coercive recruitment strategies that had been in place for more than a century at this point, British sailors essentially are going to begin recruiting for the Royal Navy anywhere from the sort of coastal communities of Britain to the West Indies, to the Indian Ocean, to wherever is most viable. So essentially, naval officers demanded the right to detain foreign merchant ships and expect their crew for fugitive Englishmen. Oftentimes, their sort of rudimentary inspections were not especially useful in distinguishing subjects from foreign citizens. And so, as you might imagine, Americans are routinely swept up into the fray. And the US is going to become quite irate with the British Admiralty's refusal to sort of redress the unlawful seizure of American citizens. They're going to appoint these particular agents, the one in London being Irving's position at this point, one in the West Indies as well. And they're going to further implement a kind of protection, these certificates of citizenship, which we'll talk about more in just a moment. But now that Irving is in London, he's serving as the agent there. He is essentially tasked with re-examining cases for hundreds of stranded and destitute sailors and kind of determining as to their citizenship and their time of service in the British Navy, if they are who they say they are or not. While most petitioners likely had legitimate recourse, the prospect of aid in whatever form led plenty of British-born sailors to submit their own petitions. And Irving at this moment really positions himself as someone who is, in his words, so well acquainted with those circumstances within which the claims of the men of the character of the American citizens might be ascertained, that he kind of puts himself forward as an uncommonly apt adjudicator, I guess. It's sort of unclear what his actual process was. He doesn't give us many of those details. But I think what is really essential to understand is that we have people at sea where their nationality is kind of constantly in question. And then we have people increasingly being put in these sort of consular positions who are going to be asked to facilitate this kind of adjudication process, whose own nationality and whose own claims to sort of belonging are equally fraught. So I mentioned the sailors' protection certificates, and I wanted to talk about these in a little bit more detail. I don't have a ton of time to get into them today, but essentially this was a preventative measure where for about a 25-cent fee, customs collectors would issue individual sailors these certificates of citizenship. They were issued to white and black sailors alike, irrespective of race, upon review of a notarized affidavit. They were meant to be kind of issued domestically initially, but very quickly that expands to include foreign consuls. And if you know anything about the consular service more broadly at this moment, it is kind of infamously corrupt. And so allegations of misuse very quickly hindered the efficacy of these documents. It's also not really within British interest to recognize them as legitimate. And so the Admiralty very quickly accuses the US Consular Service of fostering an illicit trade in protections or unacceptable negligence in their sort of evaluation process. So they're not especially functional in many respects. But it is a fascinating and a pretty radical intervention into the citizenship question at this moment. So I just wanted to highlight them. This is one, the one in the back of your screen is from a Black sailor. And then this is another one in the Connecticut Museum collection, actually, that is from a white sailor, but just to give you a sense of sort of what these look like. So you would have men carrying these. And this is sort of the first attempt to create a kind of state-sponsored delineation of who is a citizen and who is not. Irving, I want to really just point out, is not an anomaly. He's one example. There's a lot of other men we could talk about today who are quite similar, men born into Loyalist families, raised abroad, who then served the US as consuls during this period. And when we follow them, we're really looking at men who have this very fraught relationship to American identity, who are then also professionally responsible for determining how American identity functions in foreign courts, how it is going to be recognized, who is going to be legitimized as an American and who will not. So interesting, kind of in the last third of my talk, to talk about some of these examples from a different perspective and get into some other case studies. So we might leave Irving behind for a moment. But we've talked quite a bit about coercive enlistment in the Royal Navy. The men on your screen are not men we're going to talk about in great depth. But just to acknowledge that the most prominent loyalists at this time, the most prominent kind of children of loyalists are all going to be officers in the Royal Navy. Most of them enlisted at very young ages during the course of the American Revolution, anywhere from like 12 to 15 years old. And then in the 1790s become quite prominent as American-born officers, though they don't tend to deal with the same sort of questioning of their identity that a lot of these other people will. So we have these sort of divergent histories when we're thinking about the sailors themselves. One of these kind of wealthy and well-allied traders from a certain perspective in positions of power who are sort of hardly American at all. And the other side of that being these sort of impoverished, often more anonymous men ripped from their kind of rightful allegiances to the United States, which I think is a sort of massive oversimplification. And we'll get into that. So this is not a picture of Nicholas Boylston. The man you see pictured on your screen is his father, Ward Nicholas Boylston. As far as I'm aware, there's not a portrait of Nicholas to show you. But Nicholas was 3 years old when he left New England. His father, Ward, was the eldest son of Boston's customs commissioner, so one of the city's most prominent loyalists at this moment. His mother, however, was the daughter of quite a fervent patriot. So soon after Nicholas's family settled in London, the marriage very quickly fell apart. Nicholas then grew up under the supervision of his paternal family, his mother having died at sea in 1799. Nicholas's uncle was an officer in the Royal Navy. In 1784, he was 12 years old when he accompanied his uncle to the Leeward Island station as his uncle's servant is how he's identified on the muster roll, which is quite a common, a pretty appropriate entry point to the naval service for a young man, particularly if they have sort of designs towards advancing in the officer corps. It didn't work for Nicholas, as maybe his family has hoped. As soon as the ship returned from the West Indies, he disembarked. And then we don't really hear from him again until about 10 years later, when in October 1794, he's now 22 years old, and Nicholas arrived in Charleston. And he returns to the United States, returns to Charleston with these intentions of assuming command of a vessel that his father is going to fund and sailing a transatlantic trade route between London and Charleston to further his family's commercial interests. He was kind of enthusiastic about the mercantile prospects, in part because of this increasing opportunity for American traders because of the ongoing French wars. And essentially uses this opportunity to secure a ship as a kind of apology. A lot of Nicholas's correspondence doesn't survive, but in most of his correspondence, he is apologizing for kind of misbehaviors. Tend to go unnamed, but he seemed to have a pretty significant drinking problem. He seemed to have a pretty significant gambling problem, and other sort of vices that would follow him throughout his life. Nicholas, in his 3 months in Charleston, married. He would have a son later that year with his wife, Mary Eliza, who was a young woman from Charleston, and then sets out on this ship in a journey that is very quickly overturned. And the next time we see him, he is stranded in Calais, his ship having been confiscated by French privateers. And it becomes increasingly apparent that Nicholas has no options left but to join the Royal Navy. And so over the next about 15 years or so, he will go back and forth between London, positions in the Royal Navy, and the United States, up to the point that his father, having moved back from Boston and having moved back from London and returned to Boston, will basically make the claim to Nicholas that he will continue to support Nicholas only if Nicholas agrees to never again set foot in the United States. So it's not a great ending for him. He ultimately dies in London in 1839. But when we think about someone in this position, I bring him up today as a sort of example of the sort of kind of case studies of who these men were, what it meant to be members of some of these families. It becomes incredibly challenging to label Nicholas an Englishman or an American with much authority, except really upon the outcome of his failures. His merchant career floundered kind of at first venture, and he drifted between cities and vices. His marriage to Mary Eliza languished for years and then decades. They ultimately died separated and didn't see each other really after 1805. His service in the Royal Navy was really a matter of necessity and convenience. Whatever patriotism he possessed was born of self-interest. And it was often achievement or ambition which forced the question, neither of which Nicholas seemed to possess. And so the economic realities were as significant to the kind of human geography of this Anglo-American divide as anything. Men often became American or British by default when they couldn't afford otherwise. When Nicholas possessed the freedom to choose, he often gravitated towards the United States, though he spent most of his life in Britain, and he died in London because really he lacked the resources to be anywhere else. He served in the Royal Navy for the same reason. And so I mention this in particular because when we're thinking about these sort of men with complex histories, complex relationships to nationality and national character in positions like a consular position, we're also thinking about them interacting with men who have these sort of equally fraught backgrounds. And I, of course, am talking about men who have relationships to loyalism, and that's sort of what has kind of sparked their unusual itinerancy in life. But that was in no way kind of exclusive to this particular group. This isolating this group in a lot of ways just allows us to see them easily in the historical record. So I'll leave you with one last example that's has kind of greater connections to Connecticut and is quite interesting in and of itself and pulls us away a little bit from sailors. But that is William Birdseye Peters. Again, this is his father pictured, not him. But he was the son of Reverend Samuel Peters, who left for London in 1774, so the same year that William was born. William's mother died in childbirth, and so he was raised with his maternal grandparents until he was 14 years old when he joined his father in England. William was then educated in France and then at Oxford before he briefly returned to the United States in 1793. He married an American woman in 1796 before moving again into Upper Canada, where his elder half-sister Hannah had married a British imperial administrator and was living there. If you remember Sarah Troutbeck from the beginning of this talk, I'll just add here that Hannah Peters fled the colonies in 1774 with the Troutbeck family, in part because both Samuel Peters and John Troutbeck were Anglican ministers, and so had a connection in that way. William then, in Canada, practiced law and received a commission in the Queen's Rangers, which was a Loyalist army regiment. He later, kind of after some family quarrels, tried to apply for a commission in the US Army at Fort Niagara until his brother-in-law intervened and kind of disallowed that. He then moved back to the United States in 1803, lived there until 1808 when he declared bankruptcy, moved back to Canada, began practicing law again. That didn't work out. And in the early 1820s, he moved back to New York before dying in Mobile, Alabama on a move down south. So I mentioned this again, it's just kind of another example of this sort of hyper itinerancy that we're going to see in some of these individuals, where nationality is not, for these particular people, an immutable fact that is going to remain with these men throughout the whole of their lives. We'll often see men like this or others sort of run away from it or perform it as if it's like a character that you can put on and take off. It could be something that these men would have to keep track of, or that could kind of sneak up on you in sort of odd ways. And so all of this is really contributing to a kind of widespread insecurity about what the American national character is, and how possible it is to self-construct within this sort of very ambiguous framework. So I'm going to end on this quote that is incredibly grim and is more amusing to me than anything, which is why I include it. And it's something George Irving wrote at the end of his life, saying, quote, "This is somewhere said that history teaches by example. I do not know what it teaches that is valuable, but I am sure that it teaches much that is very pernicious, and verily believe that it were better for future generations that the whole of it, ancient and modern, sacred and profane, were committed to the flames." And I'm not tossing this out there to kind of denigrate my own profession, but to say, I think that these are people who have a very vested interest in self-construction. And it becomes much harder to self-construct when there's sort of evidence of these different iterations of who they were and who they'd been. So you often see a lot of them talking in quite strong language. This is kind of the most coherent quote that I could pull, but quite strong language about what it meant to try and run away from your own personal history in order to have the sort of flexibility or freedom that you wanted, that you felt was owed to you. So I will end there. I'm happy to take questions, but thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you so much. What a complex topic. It's pretty unbelievable. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. If you'd like, you could also unmute yourself. That's fine as well. I was wondering, you mentioned that the sailors had the protection certificates. Did that ever transfer to, citizens? And then, of course, you have some sort of way to prove where people are. When do you start to see countries really adopt things like that?
Yeah, so the kind of paperwork apparati that we're accustomed to today don't come until much, much later. So what is so interesting about the protection certificates is that it is a massive effort. There's over 100,000 of them issued. They're issued to white and black sailors. There's no sort of attempt to isolate sailors based on race or to limit access to these certificates among black sailors. And that it really is the sort of only major federal intervention in this period into kind of determining who was a citizen and who was not. It then becomes quite complicated because they don't do much for you within the United States. So it's not like a black man. Ham Primus is the one example I gave from the certificate at the Connecticut Museum. But it's not as if they carry the same currency within the United States. It was really meant to be functional outside of its borders. And we don't see a kind of extension of that within the US until far beyond this period.
Are the sailors declaring who they are? I'm assuming there's really not a system to determine or validate what somebody's saying.
So the ideal would be that they would approach whoever the sort of administrator was who was issuing the certificate with a signed affidavit. Sometimes it could be from someone local to their community who had some ability to attest to the fact that they were born there, or sometimes you would see men come in with like letters from their local pastor who would talk about baptizing them, or someone else who could talk about this other experience. So it would be kind of piecemeal as a way to prove that you were who you said you were. The problem becomes, so many of these sailors run into problems where they need these certificates in the West Indies or in Central Europe or in India, where you don't have the same sort of access to this sort of documentation that's really going to be able to attest to your citizenship or not, which is why they kind of pretty immediately face a lot of accusations of being pretty useless, because you'll have people issuing the certificates just kind of on the fly to whoever shows up, or charging a lot of money for the certificates. So that is there's the kind of ideal process that was laid out in the law that pretty quickly falls to the wayside. And then it's just kind of like, depending on who is issuing it and what you could provide and if they would believe you or not.
Right, right. Judy is thinking along the same lines I'm thinking for my next question, but she's asking, you've mentioned men's citizenship, what determined a woman's?
Yeah. So the women are such an interesting conversation in this context, particularly for me. There's not, so there is a question with marriage, and does marriage determine something? And is there then a sort of more official process by virtue of marriage, in part because institutions like the Royal Navy had a naturalization process through marriage. So if you were a foreign sailor and you wanted to become a British subject, the quickest way to do that would be to marry a British woman and then serve for 2 years on a British ship. And so marriage itself became a process to gain this sort of particular political status. So that's one case where it's like they were using women to think about men's status. If we're just thinking about women unto themselves, it becomes a little bit more ambiguous. There are really interesting cases of women who, when their husbands or fathers or whoever might be flee during the revolution, they remain behind. Oftentimes it's meant to be a sort of temporary measure that they are remaining behind to protect property, or they're going to join the rest of their families later, and for whatever reason it doesn't work out that way. And so you'll see these women into the 1820s and 1830s talking about how they still get to they are still subjects. They still get to identify themselves as subjects, because by virtue of being women, they didn't have the same opportunities to leave, and they didn't ever want to be citizens. And so you don't get to kind of make that determination for them in the absence of having a kind of official apparatus to do it. So there's definitely a really interesting conversation happening with women, but it doesn't get quite so consolidated into these official channels in the same way.
Have you found any documentation of women, particularly daughters, or not really agreeing with their fathers if they chose to become a loyalist? I mean, they don't really have much they can do about it, but still, anything that they're saying about it.
There's really interesting cases, especially in Canada, of women whose families will have left, particularly New England, and decided to resettle in Canada. And there'll be cases of women who will refuse to marry any men in Canada and will only agree to marry men in the United States because they want to get back into the US. And so they see that as being their way to go about it. Or you'll also see families who the parents feel quite strongly that they're unwilling to return, but they will purposely send their daughters back to look for American husbands, because they think there is quite a bit more opportunity in the US for young people at this moment than in some of these places where loyalists settle. And so there's a kind of very interesting conversation with marriage that comes up quite a bit with women, and that's how they're going to sort of engineer their way back into the US.
Wow, that's really interesting. They do have a little bit of agency.
Mhm.
Anyone else have any questions? Anybody? You can feel free to unmute yourself. Anybody? We have a quiet group today. I'm really just so shocked that when you think there's such paper trails for so many things, and there's these channels that are official, but how they just fall apart so easily when push comes to shove in practice. And it's really interesting. Or the lines are so blurred, it depends on the individual administrator. That's really fascinating.
And I think what's interesting that sometimes becomes harder for us to kind of conceptualize because nationality feels so precedent today, is that these people in this particular moment, so the early national period, are coming out of um, a much longer history where nationality didn't really mean anything at all, where no one was really thinking about that, or that wasn't the most important way you would identify yourself or others. That kind of class or religion or those sorts of things were going to be much, much more important. And so we have this sort of transition that's happening contemporary to a lot of these revolutions, the American Revolution, then really the French Revolution, that are going to force people to think about nationality, but they don't necessarily have this sort of state level structures to facilitate that or to make that a kind of feasible transition with any sort of level of organization. And so really what we're kind of seeing during these periods that a lot of people like kind of making it up as they go along, and then the government's trying to kind of come in later and fix the problems,
Right.
and peel back some of the things that have gone a little bit out of control.
Such a unique time.
Did you want to ask your question? How much did it cost to have a girl go from England to America at that time?
Oh, that's a good question. It was expensive. So this is I couldn't tell you the exact amount, nor could I tell you the sort of comparison, but what I do know is that it would have you would have had to find a ship and a captain who wanted to take you and was willing to take you, and that wouldn't have been every merchant captain. And it was, we don't see a lot of sort of travel or tourism until a little bit later in the period. And so it really would have been quite essential and quite expensive to do the sort of transatlantic journey in that sense. But I don't know an exact number, but that's a great question. Thank you. Something to look up for sure.
Anybody else have any questions? Well, thank you so much, Shay. This is really such an interesting topic. I mean, so unique. We don't often hear, you're one thing and then suddenly turn of events, you're something else, but you can't identify it. This is really, really interesting topic. Please come back and share with us more after you've completed more of your research and all of that.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, and I just wanted to share with everyone some upcoming events that we have going on. We have a talk at the museum on this Thursday. Ryan Carr will talk about how Samson Occam, a Mohegan, helped chart a new course for Native communities in the Northeast during this same time period, the early Republic. Carr wrote a book on Samson Occam that was published in 2023. And then we have our newest exhibition called Wide Awakes, Campaigning for Lincoln. The exhibit will open on the 14th of September, but we have a reception on the 19th, and that is also on site. That is free, and we're just celebrating the opening of this new exhibit. And then we have our next Lunch and Learn, Bound Out in the Spiritual Lives of Freeborn Black Domestic Servants. And we'll have another NERFC fellow discussing her research that she was visiting us at the Connecticut Museum, and she's going to look at the indentured system in 19th century Connecticut by looking at the life of one particular woman, Maria Wellington Miller Stewart. So please join us for that as well. And I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. You can always find out what is going on at the museum at our website, connecticutmuseum.org. And I want to thank Shea again. This was really interesting talk, and please come back and give us an update. And thank everyone for joining us today. We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Bye.